He gave them everything: his trust, his friendship, his home, and even his heart. But what happens when the very people you trust most turn against you? When love becomes betrayal, and friendship conceals deadly intentions? A loving wife he thought he had secrets affair, a trusted friend's dark intentions, and a $1 million motive, all culminating in a single gunshot that shattered a family and a community. This is a story of George Young, a man whose kindness became his undoing, and whose murder that left everyone asking, how could this happen? Welcome to True Crime IQ. The best and least you can do to help my channel is to like, subscribe, and share. Let's unravel this chilling story together. George's story begins long before the tragic events of November 2017, in the southern town of Beaufort, a suburban community in Gwinnett County, Georgia. In Georgia, where diligence and perseverance were deeply ingrained values, George grew up in a simple home as the middle of 3 children. Despite financial constraints, love was always abundant in their family. From a young age, George was driven by an unquenchable curiosity about how things functioned, especially anything mechanical or electrical. His father, a skilled mechanic, often took him to work, where George learned the importance of meticulousness and responsibility. After graduating high school, George pursued a degree in criminal justice, a field that perfectly aligned with his fascination for technology and his strong desire to help others. He worked his way through college, and when he graduated, he founded his own security company, and by his mid-30s word had gotten around of his proficiency in his line of business. Due to his reliability, his business grew by leaps and bounds. George Young was the kind of man you couldn't help but admire. A devoted husband, a loving father, and a trusted friend. He wore every role with grace and humility. As the owner of a successful security company, George wasn't just respected for his professional achievements, he was admired for his unwavering integrity, his generosity, and his willingness to help those in need. At home, he was the rock of his family, a man who adored his wife and cherished his 3 children. Whether it was coaching his kids through life's challenges, or simply sharing a laugh around the dinner table, George always put his family first. He had a natural way of making everyone around him feel safe, protected, and valued. To his friends, he was dependable. To his employees, he was a leader. And to his community, he was an example of what it means to be a good man. But even the strongest foundations can crack. And sometimes, the very people you love and trust the most can be the ones who shatter your world. George and Tia Young had what seemed like the perfect love story. He met her in 1995, and for 22 years they shared a life that many would envy. They built their marriage on the promise of forever, weathering the storms of life together and celebrating its joys side by side. Together they raised 3 beautiful children in their cozy home in Beaufort, Georgia, a home filled with laughter, love, and cherished memories. George was the steady anchor of the family, a man who worked tirelessly to ensure his loved ones had everything they needed. As the primary breadwinner, he poured his heart into his security business, driven by a simple yet profound mission to provide a better future for his family. Tia, meanwhile, was the heart of the household. She took care of the children and maintained the warmth of their home, standing as a pillar of support for George. To the outside world, they were a picture-perfect couple. Friends admired their bond, and neighbors saw them as an example of love and partnership. But behind the smiles and shared moments, there were cracks, small, almost imperceptible fissures that no one else could see. Over time, those cracks would deepen, leading to a betrayal so profound it would unravel everything they had built together. What happens when love turns into resentment? When shared dreams turn into secrets, and trust is replaced by lies? The answers would shock everyone who thought they truly knew the Young family. The narrative takes a more suspenseful turn with the arrival of Harvey Tim Lee. Tim entered George's life through a shared acquaintance, and the 2 men quickly formed a strong bond. Tim, facing challenges in securing stable employment, appeared to George as someone simply needing an opportunity. George, ever the optimist, saw potential in Tim that others seemed to miss. When Harvey fell on hard times, George didn't hesitate. He extended a hand, offering not just a roof over Harvey's head but a place in his life. George welcomed him into their home, a gesture of kindness that spoke volumes about the man George was. But he didn't stop there. Recognizing Harvey's potential, George offered him a job at his security firm, giving him the opportunity to rebuild his life with dignity and purpose. To George, it was simply the right thing to do. He believed in second chances, in lifting others up when they needed it most. Harvey became a trusted friend, a confidant, someone George could rely on both at work and at home. But trust, as George would tragically discover, can be a double-edged sword. While George was busy building Harvey up, Harvey was quietly tearing him down. A hidden danger festered within their friendship, a betrayal that would not only shatter George's life, but also crumble everything he had built. How does a bond forged in trust and generosity turn into the ultimate act of betrayal? As the layers of this story unfold, the truth behind Harvey Lee's intentions will leave you questioning just how well you truly know the people closest to you. It started innocently, as these things often do. Harvey Lee had been living with the Young family for nearly 2 years, a guest in their home thanks to George's generosity. At first, Harvey and Tia Young barely exchanged more than polite conversations. Tia, ever the devoted wife and mother, was focused on her family, while Harvey was working to rebuild his life. But over time, the boundaries blurred. It wasn't clear when exactly the lines were crossed. Maybe it was a casual joke shared in the kitchen, or a lingering glance during a family dinner. What began as harmless small talk evolved into deeper conversations where Harvey found himself drawn to Tia's confidence and charisma. She was magnetic in a way he hadn't noticed before. Tia was the kind of woman who carried herself with poise, a presence that made her seem untouchable. Yet, in those stolen moments, Harvey saw a different side, a vulnerability, a longing for something she felt was missing. For Tia, Harvey was a refreshing escape from the routine of her life. He listened to her in a way that George, busy with work and providing for the family, hadn't in years. Harvey's compliments were subtle at first, almost careful, but they grew bolder, more personal. Tia didn't stop them. In fact, she began looking forward to their interactions, and so, the seeds of their affair were planted. A fleeting connection turned into late-night conversations, text messages exchanged when no one was watching, and moments stolen in secret corners of the house. They became experts in deception, perfecting the art of hiding in plain sight. To George, nothing seemed amiss. Why would it? Tia was his wife, the woman he had loved for over 2 decades. Harvey was his friend, the man he had gone out of his way to help. George's trust in both of them was absolute. The idea of betrayal was unthinkable. But Tia and Harvey's secret was growing harder to contain. They communicated carefully, using coded messages and deleting their conversations immediately after. They thought they were untouchable, confident that their cleverness would keep them safe. What they didn't realize was that every digital trace they left behind, every text message, every call, would eventually become their undoing. November 16, 2017. An ordinary evening that would become anything but. It was a cold night in Beaufort, Georgia, and George Young had just finished his long shift at work. He had spent the day making sure his clients were safe, handling his business with the usual professionalism he was known for. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, nothing out of place. He was just returning home to the family he loved, eager to shed the weight of the day and step back into the comfort of his life. As George pulled into his driveway, the familiar quiet of the neighborhood surrounded him. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the cool air. He had no reason to suspect that his life, his family's life, was about to change forever. But as George walked up to his front door, a figure emerged from the darkness. The air was heavy with tension, as the sound of footsteps echoed in the quiet night. A split second of confusion, then the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Boom! George fell to the ground, the life draining from him in an instant, as his killer fled. The plan had been executed with terrifying precision. Harvey Lee, the man George had helped rebuild his life, had been waiting for this moment. The shot that ended George's life was meant to be the final step in a plot of betrayal, one that had been carefully laid out for months. Harvey was the one who pulled the trigger, but this was no solo act. Behind him, hidden in the shadows, was Tia, the woman George had loved and trusted with his heart. As George lay dying on his porch, Tia's world, the world she had so carefully built on lies and deception, was crumbling around her. The moment was final. The life of the man who had given her everything was over. But the murder wasn't just an act of violence. It was the culmination of months of plotting, of deceit, of turning love into something dark and deadly. George's family, his wife, his children, the people who had trusted him and depended on him, had no idea that this night, this tragic night, would forever tear their world apart. And as the authorities arrived on the scene, the chilling truth began to unravel. What had seemed like a random act of violence was quickly revealed to be something far more calculated, far more horrifying. George Young had been murdered not by a stranger, but by the very people who should have protected him most. His wife, his friend. Together they had destroyed everything he had worked so hard to build. The murder of George Young stunned the small town of Beaufort. A beloved husband, father, and friend, gone in an instant, his life taken from him on his very doorstep. The police investigation began immediately, but the one person who seemed to struggle the most was the woman who should have been most affected by the tragedy, his wife, Tia. In the days following George's death, Tia was everywhere. She stood before the cameras, her tear-streaked face a portrait of sorrow, as she pleaded for answers. In the quiet, controlled voice of a woman in shock, she begged the public to come forward with any information about the killer. "I just want to know who did this to my husband. He was a good man. He didn't deserve this. Please, if anyone knows anything, I need your help," she said, her eyes wide with the kind of desperation that only a wife who had lost her soulmate could convey. To the world, Tia's emotional appeal seemed genuine. The grief, the anguish, the raw vulnerability, it all seemed so real. Her words were laced with the kind of sorrow only a loving spouse could express. But behind the tears and the public plea, there was a secret so dark it would shake the very foundation of everything she claimed to stand for. Because Tia's grief wasn't just from losing her husband, it was from the fear of what was to come, the guilt that was quietly eating her alive. What would make a married woman act like that? What would drive her to betray the man who had supported her for over 2 decades? The man who had given her a life of comfort and love? Was it love lost? A craving for something more? Or was it something darker? A need for control, for power, for the thrill of the forbidden? The truth, as the investigation would soon reveal, was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The woman who stood before the cameras, pleading for justice, was also the mastermind of the plan that led to her husband's murder. She wasn't just mourning George's death, she was hiding the fact that she had orchestrated it. As the investigation into George Young's tragic murder began, the initial shock and sorrow soon gave way to suspicion. At first, Tia's emotional plea for answers seemed genuine, her distress palpable. Harvey Lee, ever the friend, offered his support and helped to spread the word about the unsolved crime. But as the days passed, small inconsistencies began to surface in their statements, tiny cracks in the stories they were telling. Tia claimed she had been at home when George was killed, not knowing anything was wrong until the police arrived. Harvey too gave his account, playing the role of the grieving friend who has always been there to help. But there was something in the way they spoke, in the details they omitted, that didn't sit right with the investigators. Their stories seemed too rehearsed, their answers too perfect. They both appeared a little too calm, a little too composed for people who had just lost someone so close. And then there was the matter of their relationship, one that was beginning to unravel under the scrutiny of the investigators. Detectives soon discovered that Tia and Harvey's connection wasn't as innocent as they had led the world to believe. On the night of the murder, when Tia heard the gunshots, she didn't call 911 immediately, this giving room for whoever the murderer was to escape from the crime scene. In fact, they had been more than just friends. They had been having an affair for months, a secret that neither of them could hide forever. Their clandestine relationship had been a well-kept secret, but now it was beginning to surface, one small clue at a time. The evidence was starting to build. Investigators uncovered text messages between Tia and Harvey, messages that showed a level of intimacy far beyond that of mere friendship. They had been communicating in the hours leading up to George's murder, arranging their plan with the kind of precision that only those with an agenda could manage. And so, the once tight alibis began to unravel. The lies they had so carefully crafted to protect their affair and deflect suspicion were starting to come to light. The investigators weren't just looking at a murder anymore. They were looking at a carefully orchestrated plot to end George's life and claim everything he had worked so hard for. As the truth began to emerge, the question was no longer who had killed George Young. It was why. Why would Tia, the woman who had promised to love and honor her husband, betray him in such a devastating way? Why would Harvey, a man George had once called a friend, turn on him so coldly? As the investigators dug deeper, they uncovered an unsettling conversation between Harvey and Tia, one that would change the entire direction of the case. Behind closed doors, in the shadows of their affair, they had discussed something far darker than just their illicit relationship. Harvey, desperate and consumed by greed, had spoken openly about the one obstacle standing in their way: George Young. In a private conversation that seemed almost casual at the time, Harvey had said what both of them had been thinking. George was the only thing standing between them and everything they wanted. Tia, by then, had already begun to resent the very man who had given her so much. Their affair had created a web of lies, but it was also the spark that ignited a dangerous desire for control and money. The motive for George's murder wasn't just about revenge or anger. It was about something much darker: greed. And at the heart of that greed was a life insurance policy worth $1 million. It was a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation. The policy had been taken out years earlier, but it was the amount, the sheer value, that stood out. If George died, Tia would stand to inherit a fortune. She would be free from the weight of financial burden, and free to start a new life with Harvey, the man who had shared her bed and now her deepest secrets. But that wasn't all. George's thriving security company, the one he had built from the ground up, was another coveted prize. Harvey, once a friend and employee, had already started making plans to take over the company. Over time, he had become more than just a trusted confidant. He was plotting to step into George's shoes, to take control of everything George had built, using Tia's position as his stepping stone. Together they saw George's business as their ticket to power and wealth, and his life insurance as the final piece of the puzzle. Harvey knew that with George out of the way, he could walk in and claim the company as his own. The future would be theirs to shape, and they could finally live the life they had always dreamed of, free from the constraints George had placed on them. But they needed George gone, and as the investigation revealed, that plan was set in motion with chilling precision. Harvey had been the one to pull the trigger on the night of George's murder, but it was the conspiracy between him and Tia that made the crime so calculated, so cold. They thought they had it all figured out, that their perfect crime would go unnoticed, that they could erase George from their lives and walk away with everything they wanted. But as the investigators continued to uncover their hidden motives, they realized that the greed that had driven them to murder had also left behind a trail of damning evidence, one that would lead to their inevitable downfall. The question now wasn't just how George died, but why he had to die at all, and the answer was clearer than ever. The murder was a way to claim not just his life, but his legacy. 5 months after George Young's shocking murder, the investigation had hit a crucial turning point. What began as an open case with few leads had now evolved into a clear path of betrayal and greed. The twists and turns had uncovered the truth, and the people who had once been considered the victims were now the prime suspects. In April 2018, the authorities had pieced together enough evidence to make their move. Tia Young and Harvey Lee, once the face of grief and confusion, were now facing a far more terrifying reality. The phone records, the text messages, the inconsistencies in their statements, it all pointed back to one damning conclusion: they were responsible for George's death. The arrests were swift, but that didn't make them any less shocking. Tia, who had publicly mourned her husband and pleaded for justice, was taken into custody in her own home. The sight of her handcuffed and escorted out by the police was a stark contrast to the image she had carefully crafted in the public eye. She had once been the picture of a devoted wife, now she was the accused, her world crumbling around her. Harvey's arrest came shortly after, as detectives moved quickly to round up the man who had once been George's trusted friend. Harvey had spent months walking freely among the people who had known George, pretending to be the supportive friend, the one who would help bring justice. But as the pieces fell into place, Harvey found himself caught in the web of his own lies. The two were charged with murder and conspiracy, each facing the gravity of their actions. What had once seemed like an unimaginable betrayal was now a matter of cold, undeniable truth. As they stood before the cameras, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. Tia's tears were no longer those of grief, but of fear. Fear for the future she had once thought was hers for the taking. Harvey too knew what was coming. The life they had planned together, the one built on lies and manipulation, was falling apart. But the arrests were just the beginning. The trial ahead would reveal even more about the dark, twisted plan that had led to George's death. And for Tia and Harvey, the fight for their freedom was about to become a battle they couldn't win. The trial of Tia Young and Harvey Lee began in 2019, and it would be a defining moment in the quest for justice for George Young. The courtroom was filled with tension, as the prosecution presented a case that would shake the very core of those who had once believed in Tia and Harvey's innocence. The key evidence against the pair was damning. The prosecution presented a mountain of texts, phone records, and witness testimonies that pieced together the final hours leading to George's murder. Investigators had uncovered conversations between Tia and Harvey, planning George's death with chilling detail. These messages didn't just reveal their affair, they showed the cold, calculated manner in which they had orchestrated the murder, discussing everything from the timing of the crime to how they would split George's life insurance policy and his business. The evidence didn't stop there. Forensic experts testified about the fatal gunshot that ended George's life and how it had been fired at close range. The authorities had found Harvey's fingerprints on the weapon, tying him directly to the crime. The fact that he had been the one to pull the trigger was undeniable. Witnesses also took the stand, including a close friend of George's who spoke about the close bond George had shared with Harvey before everything fell apart. This testimony was particularly powerful, showing that Harvey wasn't just a bystander in this tragedy, but an active participant in the plot. The defense, however, was determined to fight back. They tried to paint a different picture, one in which Tia was a grieving widow, and Harvey was simply a man caught up in a tragic situation. Their argument was that Tia had no part in the murder, that she had loved her husband and was just as much a victim of the crime as anyone else. Harvey's defense, meanwhile, tried to downplay his role, suggesting that he had acted out of fear or under duress, influenced by forces beyond his control. But the jury wasn't convinced. The emotional testimonies, the mounting evidence, and the undeniable facts of the case created a powerful argument for the prosecution. As the trial progressed, it became clearer with each passing day that Tia and Harvey were not the victims, they were the perpetrators of a crime driven by nothing but greed and betrayal. In the end, the case was not just about the loss of a man's life, it was about the destruction of a family, a marriage and a friendship. The courtroom witnessed the unraveling of everything George had worked for, and the painful truth that the people he had trusted most were the ones who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. As the trial came to a close, the courtroom was filled with a sense of anticipation as the jury deliberated over the fate of Tia Young and Harvey Lee. The evidence against them had been overwhelming, and the testimonies had painted a picture of betrayal so profound that it was hard to believe the two had once been trusted figures in George Young's life. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdicts. The charges were clear, and the sentences certain. Tia Young was convicted of felony murder, aggravated assault, and criminal attempt to tamper with evidence. Her role in her husband's death was undeniable. She had not only orchestrated the murder, but had also tried to cover her tracks, attempting to erase any signs of her involvement. Tia's conviction was a sobering moment for everyone who had once known her as a devoted wife and mother. The woman who had once stood before cameras, pleading for justice for George, now faced the consequences of her own dark actions. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The weight of her betrayal would follow her for the rest of her life. Harvey Lee, once a trusted friend and employee, faced even more severe charges. He was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. His role in the murder was not just as an accomplice, but as the one who had taken the ultimate step, pulling the trigger that ended George's life. The evidence against him had been undeniable, and the jury found that his actions were not out of fear or desperation, but coldly calculated and driven by greed. Harvey's conviction was a stark reminder that betrayal comes with a price. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never again walk free, never again be the man he had once been. His involvement in George's death would define the rest of his life. For both Tia and Harvey, the verdicts brought an end to the story of George Young's murder, but it was far from the end of their journey. They would spend the rest of their days facing the consequences of their actions, the lives they destroyed, and the trust they betrayed. The impact of George Young's murder rippled far beyond his immediate family. It sent shockwaves through the entire community. Beaufort, Georgia, once a quiet town where everyone knew each other, was left grappling with the staggering reality of what had transpired. For those who had known George, the news was almost impossible to believe. The man they had trusted, the man who had been the pillar of his family and a friend to so many, had been taken in the most brutal of ways. And even more shocking was the revelation that his murder had been orchestrated by his wife and his closest friend, people he had once opened his home and heart to. George's generosity had always been his defining trait. He had given so much to the people around him, whether it was providing employment to those in need or offering a helping hand to a friend like Harvey Lee, who had once been down on his luck. George had given Harvey not just a job, but a place to stay when he needed it most. He had offered him the kind of trust that only a true friend would offer, the kind of friendship that meant giving someone the chance to rebuild their life. But what Harvey did in return, what both Harvey and Tia did, was something that would forever change the perception of those who knew them. The community couldn't fathom how someone so close to George, someone who had been embraced by his kindness and generosity, could turn on him so brutally. Harvey had become like family to George, and yet in the end it was Harvey who had pulled the trigger. The betrayal was more than just a personal tragedy, it was a betrayal of the very fabric of trust that held the community together. For Tia, the shock was no less profound. She had been known as a loving wife and mother, someone who had always seemed devoted to her family. How could she too have been involved in such a heinous act? To the community, it was a betrayal they couldn't comprehend. How someone could go from loving and nurturing to being capable of taking a life in such a cold, calculated way. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had once known the Young family felt the weight of the loss deeply. They mourned the man they thought they knew, the friend they thought they could count on. And as the details of the murder came to light, they struggled to reconcile the man who had given so freely with the way he had been betrayed. The aftermath of George Young's murder was felt most deeply by those who loved him the most, his children. In the blink of an eye, their world had been turned upside down. They had lost a father, not to illness or accident, but to the betrayal of the two people they had trusted the most, people who should have been their protectors. Their mother, Tia, the woman who had raised them, was now a convicted murderer, and Harvey Lee, the man who had been a close family friend, had turned out to be their father's killer. The weight of this loss, compounded by the overwhelming sense of betrayal, was something no child should ever have to endure. The young children, still young, now faced the harsh reality of growing up without a father, and with a mother who would be spending decades behind bars. The emotional toll was immeasurable. How do you make sense of something like this? How do you explain to a child that the people closest to them, people they trusted, were responsible for taking their father's life? The shock was compounded by the confusion, the anger, and the grief. The children would have to navigate their futures with a sense of loss that would never truly heal. The absence of their father would always be a part of their story. But the betrayal by their mother, the woman who had been their primary source of love and stability, was something even harder to process. How could they reconcile the love they once had for her with the harsh reality that she had been a central part of their father's death? Extended family members too felt the crushing impact. George's relatives, who had always seen him as the rock of the family, now had to cope with the profound loss of a man they held in such high regard. They mourned his life, but they also grieved for the pain his children would have to endure, growing up with the knowledge that their mother had been responsible for tearing apart their family. The impact of this tragedy wasn't just about the loss of George, it was about the destruction of the family unit itself. Relationships within the family would forever be altered. Trust was shattered, and the scars of this betrayal would affect not just the immediate family, but everyone who had known and loved George. His children would now have to rebuild their lives without him, carrying the burden of his loss and the weight of knowing the true nature of those who had once been closest to them. At the heart of George Young's tragic death lies a devastating tale of trust and betrayal. George, a man who had given so much of himself to those he loved and trusted, became the victim of the very people he had taken in, people who had once been friends, who had once called him family. The bond that he had formed with his wife Tia and his friend Harvey was shattered beyond repair by a level of betrayal that no one could have ever anticipated. In the end, the cost of that betrayal was George's life, and the lives of those who had been left behind to pick up the pieces. What makes this case so heartbreaking is not just the loss of a man with so much potential, but the devastating consequences of greed. A life lost, a family torn apart, and a community left to grapple with the impossible reality that those closest to George, his wife, his best friend, were the very ones who took him from them. Greed led Tia and Harvey to believe they could take everything from George, including his life. But in the end, it was their own lives that were irreversibly changed. This case serves as a stark reminder that betrayal can come from the most unexpected places. It asks us to reflect on how well we truly know the people in our lives and how the bonds of trust can be broken in an instant. It also forces us to confront the darkness that lies within some people, the depth of their selfishness, their willingness to destroy those they once loved in pursuit of their own desires. But there is a lesson here as well, one that we must all take to heart. It is a reminder that we must remain vigilant, not just for our own safety, but for the safety of those we care about. We must be aware of the signs of manipulation, the red flags of betrayal, and be willing to protect those who are most vulnerable. Communities must stand together, united in support for the victims of crime, so that no one has to face such devastating consequences alone. As you reflect on George's story, consider how it may be more than just a tragedy. It's a cautionary tale for all of us. And as we close this chapter, remember that every story has layers, and every case holds secrets that are waiting to be uncovered. If you found yourself captivated by this case, stay tuned, because the next story is already waiting to be told. Each week, we dive into another story of betrayal, justice, and the human condition. Join us again as we continue to unravel the darkest corners of human nature, because sometimes the truth is more shocking than fiction. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest true crime documentaries. Share your thoughts below. How do you think George's case could have been prevented? What signs should have been noticed earlier? Join the conversation, and we'll see you in our next video.